Welcome to the Tripod, the official podcast of San Clemente High School. I'm your host, Bish. When I think of a person's identity, I think about personal beliefs and core values. And for some, religion plays a big part too. So our school newspaper, Triton Times, put together a panel of students whose relationships with religion differ. Here's the conversation that manifested.
Okay, so let's start by a clockwise introduction from my vantage point. Go for it. Let's hear your name and anything else in particular.
Okay, I'm Clara, and I'm a non-denominational Christian. I grew up in the Christian community, and I still am.
Thank you. I'm Emma. I grew up as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as we like to say now. Or just Mormon, that makes a lot more sense. I don't really know where I'm at right now, but I'm going to a Mormon school, so I know the stuff pretty well.
My name is Maxine. I am atheist, agnostic when I feel like it, and I went to a Christian private school for a year, so I have a little bit of experience and knowledge.
I'm Gavin McAlpin. I was also raised in the Mormon Church, and now I am pretty much atheist agnostic whatever fits better.
I'm Giselle Brandt, and I identify as an atheist, and I was raised as an atheist as well. I don't have much experience around the Christian kind of community, except both of my parents were raised Catholic, but then chose to stop following that.
So my name is Andrew Winkler. I was raised and still am a member of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, which is basically just a branch of the Mormon Church.
That's awesome. And I'm Mr. Bish, and I will be moderating this conversation. First of all, I'm just kind of curious, if you were raised a certain way, but now you identify as something different, what experience or what can you pinpoint to that change in your life?
Wow. For me, it was when I came out as gay, and the church did not have a positive reaction, and I had just grown up with all of this religious trauma, and I really just had to separate myself from that. And when I did get that separation, I kind of came to terms with, I don't think it's important to define God as much as it is just to live your best life and be a good person, and that's really where any form of Christianity or religion in general is supposed to bring you.
Awesome.
My dad is a bishop in our ward, and so I've grown up in a very, I would say, pious house, probably more than even most Mormons, and we're kind of known for being a little extreme. So it's been interesting choosing my own choices and trying to ride the line of I love my family, but separating the religion from family, because there are definitely some things that bother me. But I'm just trying to hold off from thinking about it, because if I get too heated one way or the other, I would hurt my family. Not do that.
Yeah, definitely felt that.
Where does that, in terms of importance, where do your personal beliefs stand versus the love of your family? How do you balance that?
For me, it's definitely I try to be as respectful as I can to the faith still, even though I have a lot of personal experiences that have
Personal
brought
beliefs
me
and
to a point
core
where I
values
don't agree with it, and
are
I
essential
think
to one's
that there
identity.
is a lot of problems that outweigh
For some,
a lot of the positives.
religion also plays a big part.
But because my
So
family
our
still
school
believes
newspaper,
it, and that's
Triton
my
Times,
extended
put
family,
together a panel
everyone
of
in my
students
family,
whose
it's
relationships
hard to
with religion
really distance
differ.
yourself too much, because it's
Here's
still
the
so much
conversation
part of
that
your
manifested.
culture, especially still living at home.
Whose relationships with
Yeah.
religion differ.
Whenever I try and bring
Personal beliefs and core values are essential to one's identity. For some, religion also plays a big part. So our school newspaper, Triton Times, put together a panel of students
Cool.
whose relationship with religion
All right.
differ.
What type of value does religion have in your life?
Well, for me, as an atheist person, I guess, especially being raised in a household where everyone was atheist, it just didn't have any real significant influence in, the only experiences that I really had was like my grandma like putting on the Christian radio whenever I was in her car because she always wanted me to convert. But it was always kind of something that I kind of almost like thought is silly, and I think there was a certain time where I really didn't respect religion. But I think over time, as I've been exposed to more people and I've kind of tried to learn about like what its value is to other people, it's really something of like safety, comfort, and it is something that's so valuable and provides, I just think, like a really good community for a lot of people. And if they can find that within religion, I think that's really awesome and good. I just haven't personally found it for myself.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I would say the same thing as Giselle, and I would add that religion gives people a sort of structure and kind of moral code to follow. And so I think that if religion can make someone a better person, then religion is incredible. Like Giselle, I haven't really connected with that or found that that is something that I need or want in my life, but I have seen it in a lot of other people being a very, very positive influence.
I think it affects like a lot of my life, just in terms of a lot of my family, like just the way we approach decisions as a family, and just the way we approach problems, and the way we want to put ourselves out into the world, basically. Even as like what I watched as a kid, or like what we consume as people, just through the lens of just Christianity most of the time.
Veggie Tales.
Yeah, Veggie Tales and PBS Kids.
Yeah.
No Disney Channel.
Yeah. Well, I think for me the morals aspect that's what I would always kind of reference and say, oh, that's the impact that religion has in my life. But as I've become a little bit more existential, it also, I think, can provide purpose. And so at times when I feel like I'm not as close to God, I start to feel like, what am I really doing with my life? That type of questioning. But
What do you feel like when you're feeling that you're not close to God?
that the decisions I'm making don't reflect both how I was raised and and the actions that I feel like would make me feel like myself. But
Well said.
I could probably back that up with just saying, like, you feel kind of like more in the world than you would when you're not like close to God. You're kind of like more like you feel really in it rather than being kind of just like separated from it a little bit.
yeah, but there's a saying that my family brings up a lot that is like, live in the world, but don't become part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, in the Mormon Church, it's be in the world but not of the world.
Yeah.
And I think that definitely had a big impact on me, but just like growing up in the church, of like you want to have a separation from other people that is both a positive at sometimes and also dangerous at sometimes, because you definitely are separating yourself from people. And whenever there's division, it leads to further division. But whenever you are separating yourself from the bad in the world, it could be a positive thing.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because like how you kind of take that phrase, because I took it more as like you just have different experiences than people, so you choose not to participate in certain things because you don't want to be of a certain like worldliness, they call it, kind of, But yeah, it's an interesting take.
I think it's a scripture, but they will know you are Christian by your acts, and there's I think a fine line, because I think some people will interpret that as, oh, I can't associate with those people because, and it's not really that. You're not separate in that sense. You're separate by the decisions you make, but you still need to show everyone love no matter what their decisions are. And that's another essential aspect of being Christian, in my opinion, at least how I was raised, that I think some people lose track of.
How do you feel about people that identify as Christian but don't act like one?
Well, I mean, I'm not a perfect Christian. I don't know anyone who really is. And so in that sense, if they call themselves a Christian, I mean, obviously, if they're doing things continuously that's not good, then maybe you go and you try to, hey, just ask them about it, see if you can understand what they're going through, if they need any help. But I mean, everyone's going to make mistakes. Everyone's going to do things that may not be right in the eyes of the church or in the eyes of God. And I think, so as long as you're it's more about trying, I think.
Yeah.
I think I understand that too, because it's like, for me, it's fine because no one's perfect. I think I just have a problem with people that portray themselves either on social media or through just how they are as perfect Christians, and I'm like, but you're not, and that's fine, but don't portray yourself as such, like, perfect.
Yeah, I think it leads a lot back to what you were saying, the scripture that says, you will know them by their works, is that, like, real Christianity, as it should be, is defined by following the teachings of Christ and of these prophets that are teaching of good things. But it's sometimes misguided because churches are led by people, and people are all imperfect, and so it's hard to separate what is church, what is religion, what is teachings from God in the scriptures. And then when you translate that into real life, people will be living by terms that are deemed okay, or even sometimes not okay, but because of things that are taught, like repentance and things like that, you can always come back to being okay. And so I feel like even when someone is this perfect Christian online and then is not acting that way, it is really just a show of the person looking at them, of whether they are or not following their own teachings of judgment, or if they're just letting people find their way back to that repentance.
I like how you separated kind of like religion and church, because that's how for me too, because I see more church as a community rather than and then religion just as my personal relationship. But yeah, it's interesting.
That's super cool. Let's go to the public sector. Do you think it's important to hold religious views in public office?
No. I don't think it's important, especially because I think a lot of our government is supposed to be secular. So holding up particular religious values, I think especially in America, we associate, especially Western religions, with morality. And I think it's really hard for us to separate Christian morals versus just being a person, because now I think that we have this social kind of pressure to follow a certain set of rules. There's certain standards that people live by, whether they're Christian or not, and I think that a lot of times that gets misconstrued. So I think that's why we have such an overrepresentation of Christians in Congress, and why politicians especially run on this ticket that I'm a good Christian person, because that's a measure of their virtues, and I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think it's especially dangerous when they start to let religious beliefs influence their policy making, because their personal relationship with whatever God they believe in or whatever religion they are a part of, it's not relevant to everyone. And I think it's really important to keep that separation, because everyone does have those freedoms, and enforcing a person's religion on each other is just that's breaking down other people's religious freedoms. Their freedom to express their religious views in office, I think, restricts other people's religious freedoms that they're supposed to be representing. So I think that can get really dangerous.
But aren't those Christian people representing, those Christian elected officials, aren't they just representing the Christian people that elected them? And then if you wanted a different, you know what I mean?
Well, I think especially with the whole idea of minority rights, just because there's a Christian majority doesn't mean that you can overrule their rights, of the rights of other people who don't follow the same religion. And I think that's a really fine line that people need to walk, and especially if people, especially on hot topic issues or hot button issues like abortion, it's really difficult for me to see an area where religion can have a place in politics, because especially as a person who's not religious, I don't really care per se what will happen to me if I do something that's not Christian, or there's no consequence for me within that, and I don't feel the need to follow this the moral guides of somebody else. And to me, that's restricting my freedoms to have my own beliefs in my country.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a fine line that is crossed too often in politics between the separation of church and state, and it they definitely are there to represent their personal beliefs and the beliefs that they ran on, but at the same time, when it overruns their platform, and when it becomes this thing that like religion is choosing for them instead of them choosing and them representing their population, it can be problematic. Like on Biden's first day in office, the first press whatever thing that Jen Psaki gave, someone asked her, what is Biden's stance on abortion? And instead of answering the question, she said, remember, he's Catholic. He's a devout Catholic. And so that right there is already highlighting that there is not the same separation of church and state that is constitutional and is supposed to exist. If she said he believes, along with the Catholic Church, that abortion is whatever, then that is different. But when she justifies his politics as something based on his religion, it's not him running on his own platform, it's him running on this platform of Christianity.
Did he?
Then it gets tricky because religion or not, where do your morals lie in politics? Because I would say that you should be a moral person, but religion often, for people, it becomes so important that it becomes their like way of life. And so if you elect someone who is religious, that is kind of part of the package, which is problematic in its own right. But I'm just saying, like, your personal morals and stuff like abortion feels like morals for religious people, whereas for a non-religious person it might not be. And so when you like get into like hair trigger issues like that, you have to be careful because your morals are going to influence other areas that are not necessarily part of religion either. But it's like, where's the line of not even just separation of church from state, which we should have, and for like religion's protection too. Like, it's not just for like that keeps everyone safe, but just where do your personal values come into play in politics? Like, that is a tricky area.
Yeah. I agree, because when you're looking at, I mean, Giselle brought up abortion, you don't have to be religious to believe that, you know, having an abortion is wrong, or that it's murder, or that you're killing a fetus. That honestly sometimes has nothing to do with abortion. And I think it's interesting, Gavin, how we say that separation of church and state is constitutional when, you know, the men who wrote it were undeniably very, very religious and founded their country in terms of religion and what they thought was right by the Bible. And so I think that separation of church and state may not even have existed from the beginning as much as we think it does, or hold it to be.
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, what's really important is just tolerance from the government of all the groups, because no matter your religious upbringing, you should be tolerant, and it's especially important when you're in a public office because you're representing people, and what the decisions you make are they affect everyone. But at the same time, like, if you think outside the U.S., there are states that are like, the whole mantra of the state is like it's following a certain religion, and so at that point, maybe it's okay, but I mean, in my opinion, there's no really like religious like neutrality, because even if you are atheist and you're in a public office, well, I'm conservative, but I'm not like extreme conservative. I was at this meeting thing where there were some people talking that were probably a little more extreme than I was, and they expressed the idea that the Democratic Party follows their own religion, that it's like a religion of green, and so they're basically saying that you're going to worship something that kind of pushes back to the idea that's sometimes taught in the church where I would go, where it's like, do you worship God or do you worship the world? And so there's the belief that you're going to worship your values, and whether your values stem from Judeo-Christian values, or if they stem from Muslim values, or if they stem from wherever else, from if you're atheist, then you're going to worship something was the point there.
That's exactly what I thought. And I was in another question too. That's like, is atheism really neutral? Where it's just like, I think it is a perception in our society that if you're atheist, then you're totally neutral and you're coming from this totally fact-based and totally just in the middle. But I think you come from experiences and you come from certain things and values.
I think there's just no way to know a lot of these things. And so that is tricky whenever you're in a public position because you're trying to work with like objective fact. And like the problem with that is that people are not objective creatures. So you're dealing with everyone who's got like issues. And there's like not really an easy way to like deal with all of them. And that's kind of why the US is cool in its own way, is that we do have so many different values. I think there might need to be some like realignment on how we represent everyone, because you're right, it is overrepresentative of Christians. But I think Andrew's right, there's not really a way to be super neutral, because no matter, like atheism can be neutral and based on facts to a point, and then past that point, you're going to be offending other people with your, I don't know, like belief in science.
Well, and I guess that's like the idea of atheism to me, why I consider it technically, like in a technical sense, I believe it is politically neutral, because all it is really is the rejection of the belief in a God. But that doesn't imply any other set of beliefs. So if somebody just states that they're atheist, they could be far right, they could be pro-life, they could be liberal, they could be really anywhere on the political spectrum. So I think that just like being an atheist doesn't identify you politically with any set of beliefs, whereas like some other beliefs might align more with one party or another.
But it doesn't necessarily have to. Because like especially being in this like Mormon church, right? Like it is very conservative for the most part, but there are definitely some like very far left people in there. So relatively, but I don't know. So it's not like I don't know if religion ever is going to be your set in stone one political route.
I definitely think that there isn't a definite line of if you believe in this religious system, you believe in this political system. But I do think that there's a lot of commingling. Like in the Mormon church, you have a lot more Christians, and that's just something typical, but it doesn't mean every Mormon is Christian. And so I think there's a separation on that level, and the same way that there is with atheism. But like, it's really easy to box people into things. Like for me, when we went around the circle, I said atheist, agnostic, whatever, because I don't really identify with either of those. I more just believe that, I don't know, there are things more important to guide your life than religion, and you can believe whatever you want. Like, I don't reject the idea of there being a God. I just don't think that the idea of a God is something that should be driving politics or something like that. I think that instead people need to be making their own decisions, and rather than identifying with atheism, I identify with anti-groupthink. So if there is this atheist party that is thinking together, then that has the same problem as Christianity, of everyone thinking together. I think that politics should be very personal.
Gavin, how important is it for you to have like religious identity? Because you mentioned agnostic, atheism, but then you don't really feel like you totally identify with those in general. Like, what? And then you said that you don't agree with the group, or not the group think either. So is it okay for you just to have no identity whatsoever with that, or do you need to have a label in some way, shape, or form?
So I think for me, at least, it's not important to have a label, and I don't like to label myself on just about anything. Like, as far as politics go, I definitely lean left, but I don't identify with the Democratic Party. I don't identify with any party. Mm-hmm. And so I think that for me, what I've found to be most important is making my own decisions based off my experiences, based off facts, based off things happening in the world. And I think that once you put a label on it, whether on purpose or not, and whether you are doing this or not, you're kind of subscribing to a groupthink in a way of, like, if somebody else identifies the same way as you, it's an easy bond to form.
It's really hard too, because it's like, if you subscribe to one party, then it's like you have to agree with everything, and I'm like, oh, I don't though. Like I have bits and pieces where I'm just like, I don't know if I agree with that part. So it's like, I agree with you, it's kind of hard to label yourself in that sense.
And that goes back to like, maybe we do need to change some political systems so that they're
Just
not two different parties. Like, otherwise we do this.
Cool. Do you think religious freedoms have a negative connotation for people?
I don't think they do. I think for everyone those are relatively like positive things, because not only is it like the freedom to believe in what you want, it's the freedom to not believe in something. So I think in that way everyone is really protected, and I think that's really the core thing that does promote a separation of church and state in our country. And I think that a lot of people find a lot of safety within religious freedoms that we do have provided for us and are supposed to be secure for us. And I think that those are all really positive things, whether you're in an organized religion, whether you don't identify with one, or anything.
I agree, but I was just gonna say that I think when you do bring up like some issues, it is kind of a negative. People kind of see it as something. I don't know I was going with that, Maxine.
Oh, I was going to add on to Giselle's point that I think the fact that we have so many denominations of the Christian religion is really helpful for that, because I think people that identify as Christian or Catholic, like is a natural extension for someone to be, I don't know, Presbyterian, or I think there's so many different denominations that once you get outside the realm of Christianity, like it's a little more acceptable when you're a Christian yourself. I don't know. I've found that in my experience.
In my opinion, I see what you're saying, and that you can go and choose the one that's right for you. But in my opinion, you have Christianity, then you have probably 1,000 different churches under that umbrella of Christianity, and even if in my opinion, the difference is, like, they all believe in Christ. They all, for the most part, believe in the same doctrine. They, make their own Bible that's the same but worded differently. And it seems to me like it just spurs on more, what's it called?
Division.
Yeah, division than it needs to. And what you said earlier about religion being a personal thing and the church being more just that you can go to them if you need help, but it's just that, like, it's a communal aspect where you get to go and you meet together to worship together. But, like, in my opinion, you could get anyone who identifies as Christian in the same church and preach pretty much the same things, and that there's just a lot of differences in ordinances that just are a little silly.
Organizational differences.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I found too, because I'm non-denominational, which means my church has like a denomination, and I've gone to like Lutheran churches, Catholic churches, but yeah, it's just like different styles of worship and different like sermon. Well, basically the same sermon, just different styles, but.
Terry Antonius, please call the attendance office 13022. Terry Antonius, call attendance 13022. Thank you.
But yeah, there's not too much different. My mom grew up Catholic, and she didn't really love the like, what do they call that? The ceremonial parts of it, kind of. Like, I was not baptized when I was a baby, but I was baptized like later on, just because in my church that's just like a choice you make later. But yeah, it's just interesting to see like the different ceremonial parts of it.
Yeah, I think beyond just Christianity too, every religion and a lot of non-religions too base themselves on the same beliefs and are really similar, and it's just the communication of those ideas that gets everyone mixed up. I was in India about a year ago, maybe two, and we were talking to the cab driver. Just whenever we have a long drive, we do that. And we were asking him about his religious beliefs because he subscribed to the Hindu religion. And so he was talking to us, and he's like, Christians think that we're so different. Like, we have a lot of these gods that we worship and stuff like that. Not everyone believes in all those gods. Not everyone does, but like some people do. But really, the core of it are these three gods. Can't remember all of their names, but he said that they serve three purposes. And he was like, just hear me out for a second. And he went there. We have a generator who created everything, an operator who runs everything, and a destroyer. And those are our three gods. And if you look at those together, it's generator, operator, destroyer. It is God. And so he said that really, fundamentally, we believe in this idea of God, and we just talk about it in a way of all these different gods. And so it's just understanding the same things under a different lens that I thought was so interesting. Then I studied a lot of other religions. When I first left the Mormon Church, I didn't just say, okay, no more God. I said, what's right for me? And so I looked into a lot of ancient religions, a lot of Eastern religion, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, whatever it was. And really, in my studies, I just found that they all believe basically the same thing and talk about it in a different way.
Yeah, and that's the kind of perspective and intelligence that most people lack, is what Gavin just described.
Well, worldliness too. You know, I think the unfortunate part is a lot of people live in the bubble the whole time. They don't have those other experiences of going to different countries, and obviously without that cab ride, you don't have that perspective. So it's pretty cool that you were able to get out there.
Yeah, but I do think we have to be careful.
Yeah.
Because, like, what to us looks like the same thing, to someone else might not. And so you have to be respectful of the fact that people do believe in, like, the intricacies of the differences. And that's got its place, too. Like, it's not inherently evil. I think that evil comes when you use that as an excuse to be evil. And so you have to be careful to, like, be okay with the fact that people are going to be believing something that you think is kind of silly or I don't know. So even if you don't personally have to subscribe to that, you can be okay with the fact that there are some key differences that are like just fine.
Yeah, because they're like I think the small differences can make a difference. Like, even with Mormon, like, and versus what I believe. Like, I was looking into like what like afterlife and what you guys think heaven looks like. And you guys think it goes in like levels and stuff. So it's a lot different than what I think. And you guys believe in like rewards in heaven or something like that, right? Like kind of more.
What do they call them? The 3 degrees of separation.
Yeah. So like, and that's like totally different from what I think. And that's a lot of people think just Christian and Mormon are like the same thing. So like those small differences are afterlife. You know, like that's our like.
Yeah, they're personally important, but I think on a broad organizational scale, like through politics and stuff, you're right. It is like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
I think at the same time, another little anecdote. My aunt lived a few years in Thailand, and she was just helping kids in an orphanage. And she said they were all Buddhist, and she said that for her, she's a very devout Christian. She has gone to different forms of Christianity, but she's Mormon. And she was talking about like her trying to teach them about what the Mormon Church believes would have been so unhelpful, and her trying to convert them to her ways of believing, because they live in a totally different world than the one that the Mormon Church is founded on. And so it's really just that they need to understand it in a way that makes sense for their experiences. And I think that that's where a lot of the little nitpicky bits of religion are so important, because you can't just dismiss them because, like you were saying, the levels of heaven or different things, like even just in different sects of Christianity, those differences change so much about what you believe that it really is important to look at those, but at the same time to think that like religion is a connecting thing, and when you look at only the differences, you're missing out on that.
Both are dangerous, so just be careful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely a fine line, I feel like there.
Yeah, and I like what you said about you can't look at only the differences, because oftentimes the differences have been like kind of manipulated by people in power to kind of militarize different religions against each other. I mean, if you look at like 30 Years' War or like, you know, Crusades, like it just all comes back to the idea of tolerance and not allowing your religion to spurn any ill feelings towards another.
You shouldn't let it like separate you from people, but it's okay to acknowledge that that's just different than what you believe, I think, you know.
Yeah.
It's not like as similar as you think, but also don't let it separate you from that person.
You shouldn't use it as an excuse. You shouldn't use a lot as an excuse, including politics. Like, you should not be like, well, since I'm a politician, your actions are going to speak for themselves either way. So just watch yourself a little bit and be okay with that. Like, I don't know.
People use religion to give themselves a higher ground. And I mean, always, it's such a moral, I'm better than you because I believe this, or I don't believe this. Like Giselle was saying, she said she thought other people were silly for believing in religion. I've definitely found myself that gut reaction being like, that's stupid. Like, I'll see that in everyday life, is people kind of using what they believe to think of themselves as better than another person, and that's not okay.
I think that's what I especially like have the issue with people bringing it up in politics, because I think most of the time it's to put themselves on a moral pedestal rather than to really, really actually go off of what they believe.
Or what they're doing.
Yeah, or to support what they're doing.
They still have a sex
It's-
scandal.
just to justify one policy.
All right, where do you stand on businesses refusing service to those they do not agree with?
It's bad.
Yeah. I mean,
it's bad for business, maybe, I guess.
so there is that, but at the same time, our country is built on a capitalistic system where it's the person owning the business who has full authority over how they run their business. And so it's the same thing with how masks are working right now. Like, if you want your business to require masks, you can kick customers out. People are saying, oh, that's infringing upon your rights, but as far as the capitalistic system goes, that's how it's established. And I think that if you're really addressing a problem, it's capitalism, and it's not the people running those businesses.
I think it's fine just because it's like you can find another business. There's so many options. I just don't see it as a problem as people made it out to be when kind of that case was going on. I forget what the Supreme Court case was called, but it was with that guy who had that cake shop and the gay couple. But I think it's just okay because, I mean, it's just such a personal belief, and if you don't want to be spreading a certain message, I don't think people should make you. So, and there's other shops that will do that for them.
I think like also like kind of when these like questions were drafted, we were also kind of talking a little bit about that case of I believe it was in Philadelphia, I want to say, or somewhere in Pennsylvania, that there was the Catholic adoption service that was partnered with the city, and they were refusing to adopt out to same-sex couples. And in that sense, I think that's not okay, because that's also like a legal process that they're carrying out because they were partnered with a public entity. So I think that is like kind of blurring the lines between a separation of state and church, and that's enforcing their beliefs. And especially in the case of adoption, where these kids need homes, and who are they to be the moral judge of these people just based off of their sexuality or their lifestyle choices? Especially if they can provide a safe and loving home for children.
Was this, so it was in partner with the state then? It wasn't a personal?
It was partnered with the city. Yeah, but it's still like the concept of adoption, like it's a legal process. So
Yeah,
I think
sure.
in like terms of that, if your business is carrying out something that is like a legal process, it is still kind of affiliated with the government in some way. So in that sense, I don't think it's okay for them to discriminate based off of religious beliefs, which is what they were claiming. And that case hasn't been decided yet, but it's going to be interesting to see how that turns out, definitely.
I think in the case of like religious organizations are really just protected classes. It's different than, I guess I brought up the mask example too soon because now I'm like totally going back the other way of like if it is a protected class, then that discrimination is unlawful. And it's like, I mean, just blatantly discrimination. And so I think in that respect, you kind of have to be willing to serve anybody as long as it's not something that they're choosing to do in your store, like the mask situation.
Are you talking about the businesses?
Yeah,
or?
like refusing service to someone, like say someone walks in and they're wearing a hijab, like saying you can't shop here is discrimination for their religious standpoint.
Okay, I understand that. But I think we're talking about like just like in terms of like messaging, like where it's like, I'm trying to think of what would be a good example, but like asking or making like a Muslim singer sing at like a Catholic. You know, I'm just trying to like think of a good example
So
of this.
what about like?
So like not discriminating off based off the person, but off like the maybe the message or like. Yeah.
Okay, so making a cake that says, like, happy wedding to a gay couple.
Yeah. I don't know.
Which I would call discrimination.
Yeah, because I think like also especially because that message is like a personal service that you're receiving, it's not like that message represents the company in any way. So I don't think that it's like technically an endorsement either, and then just denying services based off of somebody's life and just like who they are. I think that opens the doors for a lot of discrimination and a lot of more important things, like, you know, like where does the line end there? Like, oh, if I can't get a cake from a cake shop because I'm, you know, they don't like what I believe or something, or what my cake says, then like could they discriminate against me if I'm trying to buy just a shirt from a store or something, you know? It's just like, I guess that can like go a long way, you know? I think just like the definition of discrimination is really hard to define in terms of like a personal business standpoint, but I do think that more often than not, it's not okay, and I think that it's better to err on the side of caution with that, because I guess you just don't want that definition to like be expanded, and so people can just start like rejecting services to people,
Well,
you know?
I mean, I agree with you that it's definitely a form of discrimination, but at the same time, it's people have their own values that, I mean, there's the idea of cultural relativism where, say you're baking a cake, right? And these people in, you know, another country are ordering your cake because you run, you know, a transnational cake selling organization, and so they want you to make a cake for them that says, you know, like happy wedding or whatever, but this is a country where they practice female genital mutilation, right? So, and that's a process that is going to happen as soon as they get married, right? So, is that, like, are you able to say, no, I don't want to sell a cake to you because, like, I disagree with your practices and I'm not going to, like, support a process that I disagree with? Like, at some point, do your values overweigh the cultural relativism and the tolerance that you would like to have towards most people?
I think that is like a very interesting example, because I think I definitely do like view that question. I was thinking of it mostly like in terms of the United States, which is like a very bubble perspective, but yeah, it's an interesting line to draw, especially because like here, you know, your right to pretty much have your own views and discriminate people is technically protected, and I forget the court case that set that precedent, but as long as it's not like on an institutional level, you're allowed to discriminate against people essentially. And I guess it is really hard to say that that's not allowed, because it is your business, and if you don't want to do that, it's really hard to force somebody to do something like that. I just think that, yeah, I think that that is definitely a good point, because where can you draw the line, and where do moral conflicts come in, and what is a moral conflict for a person? Those are all really relative questions. So.
Also, I think it's interesting because I think it almost doesn't need to be put into law, because like a business would get certain pushbacks maybe from not serving a gay couple, where culture would push back against that and say that's not okay, and let's uplift these other businesses that are doing that. So it's like there's pushback and consequences of what they're doing. They're choosing to do it, so it might even hurt their business. It might help
Well,
their
yeah,
business.
like
you
for
know
that specific case, I know Broadway, as you know, an actor, they like didn't go to North Carolina for a full year because they were so upset. So like they did lose like
business. Yeah.
yeah, you're gonna lose. There's consequences to what you do.
Yeah.
So in that way, that is like what you're talking about with capitalism. It's the market forces that are gonna punish you, and not maybe the law. We could change that. Like you can make legislation, but for now, while it might be morally wrong, it's not legally wrong to discriminate. So.
I just find it interesting that not baking a cake can be thought of as, you know, using religion to discriminate against someone. I think that's the basis of what's so wrong about the whole situation, is saying, I'm not going to bake this cake because my religion says I can't. Because baking a cake isn't going to harm you or harm anyone. It's only going to make someone else happy. You're only going to provide the service that your business was built to provide. So it's like, if you're using religion as a reason to discriminate against someone, I don't feel like that's the correct and proper use of religion.
I think you're underestimating like how important that is to someone that is religious.
Sorry.
Just in terms of like, I think is an interesting viewpoint, and you're right in the sense that it's like, I think people would see it as like, well, why don't you just bake it? Because it's like, it's something that's going to be over in a week, and then you just give it to them, and then they're happy, which is good. But also just in terms of like what we see it as, it's like, it's more important than I think you see it as.
But religion is about being loving, and it's not about forcing other people to adhere to your beliefs. It's about spreading the gospel and spreading Jesus and God's love. It's not about like taking your beliefs and forcing them onto other people. And so from that perspective, like, it's not, nowhere in the Bible does it say that you can't, you know, be friends with a sinner.
Yeah, I think
You
that's
come
also-
to a sinner and you help them and you
That's also
share love in their life.
Yeah, that's a very Christian-centered way of looking at it too, because it is reliant on the Bible and the teachings of Christianity, versus the actual idea of religious freedom is that that religion can say whatever they want and have people believe that. And so to say that like it's very limiting and religion isn't about discrimination is kind of looking at religion through a perspective of that Christian-centered or other like more popularized religions, while there are other subsects of religion that specifically preach anti-gay or anti-Muslim or anti-whatever these discriminated groups. And
Right.
it's hard to differentiate between which is religious freedom and which is discrimination
Mhm.
based off of the whole idea of just total freedom of
Right.
religion.
And whether the teachings in the church itself is discrimination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it is that allowed? Which,
Right.
as it stands right now, it is.
Right.
So I see what you're saying, that obviously religion should be about spreading love and being friends with sinners, because everyone is a sinner. But at the same time, it comes down to, in my opinion, it comes back to the values of the person. And it's like, in my opinion, it's not the person enforcing their religious views on someone else. It's someone else coming in and saying, hey, endorse my decision to do this thing. Like, endorse my decision to have a gay marriage, or to, and now, I'm not
Right.
I'm not going to make the case that gay marriage is wrong, obviously, but that is the belief of that shop, of that person. And so, whether it be that gay marriage is wrong, that
Like, and maybe like even a white supremacist, maybe someone come in like a white supremacist
Yeah.
message or something, or
Yeah.
or like someone that would think that polygamy is wrong, or prostitution. And then someone is coming in and saying, hey, can I use your services to support this act, or support, because that's kind of what it was. In my opinion, it was them coming in and saying, hey, will you support my decision? And they, in my opinion, the shop just respectfully said, no, we won't, because it goes against our values. They don't believe that it's right. And I don't think that you should have to force, I don't think you should be forced to allow something that you disagree with.
and
Yeah.
you can still meet them with love and respect. It just doesn't mean you have to provide that service for them, and you could recommend somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. You don't, if you're a loving father or mother and your child does something that you disagree with, they go out and they get a tattoo, they go and they pierce their nose, right? You're not going to stop loving them. You're still going to try to be as kind and loving and show all the support that you can to them. But, you're still not going to say, yeah, I support that. Good job. Some people would, but some people wouldn't.
Yeah.
And I think that's fine.
I think America, as it functions as a system, is built, in your case, to say and be able to say, and it be perfectly allowed, that that parent could then say, no, I don't love you anymore, and revoke that love. And that's whole sort of like, as it translates to religion, is religions have the freedom, and people have the freedom to do what they want, as wrong as it may be.
Yes.
And I think that is well within their rights, as awful as it may be.
Yeah.
And
That
so
comes back
this,
to agency.
yeah, this whole discussion really isn't about whether or not it's right or wrong, it's whether or not it is legal or not. And as America functions, it's perfectly legal.
Yeah.
And Clara, like you mentioned white supremacy, I think we need to establish that there's like a big difference between something that harms other people.
Yes, like hate speech
Yeah.
versus
Sorry, I didn't mean it as
Yeah.
a direct comparison.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I just want to
Yeah.
clarify. Yeah.
Because there are legal precedents set that that's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think I was just trying to think of examples, but I didn't mean as a direct comparison.
Yeah.
How about we move on?
Yeah.
all that cake talk, I'm wishing I would have eaten before getting here. Do you agree with the statement, there is a focus on specifically Christian beliefs being unacceptable for office?
So, okay, what I think is going on right now is that the voices of these atheist or non-Christian populations are much louder than they have ever been in the past. With things like TikTok, I've seen people, whether it's politically or like religiously, whatever it is, and just social media in general, people are becoming hyper-radicalized in their beliefs because they find these communities where they can say whatever they want and they can bond over that.
It's an echo chamber.
Yeah, and so the entire world has become this system, especially since quarantine, where people have no real social interactions, it's only online, where this echo chamber has really just systemically broken everything. And so whatever voice and whatever opinion you're on, you are only hearing these voices now. It's those algorithms that set yourself up to believe this system and believe in this way that may not be right, but is the only thing you hear anymore. And so,
sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine.
I want to cut you off, but yeah, I think that like a large reason why it feels like Christians in politics are being more targeted, I think it's just because they're so overrepresented. Like there's like, I think it's like 86% of our Congress identifies as Christian. Like then there's going to be a really obvious criticism of that because that's the overwhelming influence that we have in our government. So I think that it's also important to look at it in terms of like demographics represented. Like, yeah, if you have an overrepresented class of people, then or a group of people, then that's who's going to draw the most criticism. So I think that that makes sense proportionally as well. And I think that if we had a different majority religious group in office, then I think that the criticism would be directed towards them and vice versa. So.
And I think at the same time that criticism that Christians are now receiving has been the same criticism that all other people have been receiving, all other religions have been receiving. It's just never, at least for the most part, been Christians on that receiving end. And so now that that is happening, it's like this drastic pushback of like, no, what's happening? Like we're losing our country, we're losing all these things. And it feels like an infringement on their freedoms. And there's a lot of voices in the media saying like Christianity is being attacked. And really, they're just now facing exactly what everyone else has.
Yeah, I think it's just, yeah, especially with, you were talking about like social media, it's definitely amplifies more diversified perspective on how religion influences our politics, especially Christianity. So that's definitely an interesting conversation that I think we're finally kind of being able to have with the advent of social media and everything.
I agree that Christianity as a whole has not really been attacked here, but at the same time, like, if you think back to the origins of the Mormon Church, you know, they were kind of run out of a lot of places, and so definitely specific groups have been targeted, and Christianity as a whole is targeted in some areas of the world, obviously, given that it's probably the largest. It's not many places, but Middle East.
I think that's because the separation of church and state gets blurred, and that happens here too. And like the second that you start bringing power into religions with the Crusades or anything, like that's dangerous because that's where like separation of church and state is for religion's protection, because then you don't have to like deal with the actions that aren't always like equally represented. So Christianity in office is not a bad thing as long as it stays separate. Like I do agree that it might be under fire because it feels like it's influencing policy when it's maybe not intended to. But we talked about that yesterday.
Yeah.
Because I think like also, I talked a little bit to Claire about this when we were writing her article. Well, at least I read her response, but she's kind of referencing like the situation of Amy Coney Barrett, you know, the most recent Supreme Court justice that's been, whatever it's called, put into her position. But she had received a lot of criticism over her religious beliefs and being a part of that sect of, I believe it's Catholicism, and a lot of people, they were, you know, criticizing her because it was like based off of like The Handmaid's Tale, like that show. It really dramatized her religion, and they definitely criticized her a lot for that. And I think that part of that criticism came from a belief that she did let it influence her politics, because if you look at past court decisions, there's definitely some parallels that you can see between her religious beliefs and possibly her court rulings. But also I think that a lot of that was largely influenced by sexism, because her as a woman in her religion, people just kind of were like, oh, that's a patriarchal religion, so now you're going to get like but the criticism because you're submitting to whatever role, and they just make these presumptions when that's not necessarily true, and I think that had a lot to do with her criticism as well.
I had like a hard time with that because I feel like when that was going on, I feel like a lot of people were putting on like social media like about her religion and not so much about the actual Supreme Court issue, and that was kind of weird to see because it was just like a lot about like the Handmaid's Tale, which is interesting because like people were talking about that, and it's actually like a biblical thing where it's like handmaiden to God, and I think a lot of people assume it's like handmaiden to men for some reason. But yeah, that was like weird because I feel like a lot of the time women in religion have a perception of being like oppressed and like that it wasn't their choice, which it could be at certain points, but that's like a general perception that it's like, oh, you're just oppressed by men and you want to make these decisions because of men. But, yeah.
I know this is not speaking for me, just full disclosure, but like the women in my life who are devoutly religious would be very offended by that view because they are generally intelligent women, generally being everyone's generally intelligent, and I think they view their roles as more distinct but hopefully in equal weight. I don't know how much I personally agree with that with my own experience, but I would say that it definitely, you have to be careful to not presume things because that is a form of sexism in its own right.
Yeah, and I think to just assume that she can't be empowered by her religion and make her own choices, especially as a really highly educated woman. I think that's where a lot of the religious criticism really came from.
Yeah, and even if like you do see yourself as maybe a certain role in your home, like as like through religion, doesn't mean that's how you are. I mean, she's like a lawyer and like a very high like earning lawyer and a professor. It's like I don't think she's oppressed in any way, but yeah, that was an interesting case. But
I think some of the Amy Coney Barrett stuff also came down to just being unable to trust our politicians.
Yes.
Because when she tells us that she's not going to let religion influence her court decision, we all know that's BS, basically. Like, we know that her religious viewpoints are going to influence every single decision she makes, whether she means it to or not. And, like, that's okay, but I think that's where a lot of it stems from. Like, it's almost impossible to separate church and state as an individual politician.
Well, I would agree, but at the same time, you can look at your own values but also look at the laws that you're implementing. And
oh, for sure. I'm not saying she's going to make any decisions that are like unlawful or unconstitutional. I'm just saying, like, if it comes down to, I don't know what's an example, but like
Brass tax, as they say.
What'd you say?
Brass tax.
Sure. Yeah, brass tax. Yeah, then that's going to influence her. And I think just a lot of people on maybe the atheist or liberal spectrum know that that's going to be opposite of what they want. And so that's why they were mad. It wasn't a partisan thing.
Well, that's another thing where religion does influence your politics, or at least that's how it's perceived. So, yeah, that's a fair, like, people who are atheist, religious people are automatically going to assume you're a crazy liberal. Maybe not crazy, but liberal, you know? So there definitely is that, like, personal separation that's sometimes nearly impossible.
What value do you place on a religion influencing culture?
I think it's like pretty undeniable to refute like the impact of religion, especially in American culture. I mean, even myself, like even though I don't identify as a religious person, I would say that a large set of like my beliefs are probably based within the Christian faith, just because that's so heavily influenced American culture and especially just Western culture in general, like in Europe as well. But yeah, that's really hard to separate, and even just like in like, I don't know, fashion or whatever, like in like goth people, like they often use like really religious like imagery to kind of invoke these images. So it's definitely like a method of like expression as well. So people don't like only confine it to just being in church. It's also going to influence like how people who don't identify with that church is going to cause social pressures for them. And just being founded on these principles of Christianity, I think it just kind of sets a precedent, and you get the social pressure that comes with that, which makes people more likely to conform and identify with Christian culture because it's a part of Western culture.
Well, I think objectively, like there's, even in advertising and stuff, like I think there's just this assumption that we all kind of have this base understanding of like, particularly Christianity in America, and like, it does influence how we target like audiences and stuff, because we all are exposed to this all the time. So it is in like literature and pretty much everything. But I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, I just think that's how it's ended up being.
Yeah, I think in America it's extremely hard to separate Christianity from culture. Like this conversation is proof. We don't have anyone from any religion besides Christianity here. And so it's just like, it's not as prevalent. You don't see it as often. Like in literature, especially in classes at school, you're supposed to have a basic knowledge of the Bible. Otherwise you aren't going to understand all the texts and all the references, versus like if we were reading texts from these other cultures where you might need a base understanding of the Quran or something like that, then it would be more significant in our culture. But we really only are exposed, unless we're making a very conscientious effort to get other information. In America, it's only Christianity or atheist agnostic beliefs differentiating from Christianity, but not specifically another religion.
It's interesting you say literature, because I can't remember what any English teacher told me this, but she's like, you guys should take a Bible class at some point if you're going into English or literature or something, just because it's such so riddled in books and just whatever we read. So yeah, it's like interesting to have that perspective in like those classes, because we'll be reading something and people will miss those like symbolism or those like references, and I'm like, it's interesting to have the background information. But yeah, it's definitely hard to keep that separate like into culture, because church, like we were saying yesterday, like community, and it's hard to like separate that. Community kind of permeates like that culture, I feel like. But also it's like hard, that's a hard question for me to answer, because it's like culture is just like we were saying yesterday, you almost want to separate it from religion, but yeah, it's just, you can't, it's impossible.
I do think it's like really interesting, because even just this year, like during our poetry unit, I think we were studying William Blake, and like how all of his poems are filled with analogies to like religion and like just different stories from the Bible, and I didn't understand any of it. And there were like multiple times in class when Miss Wesley would just ask, she'd be like, oh, like, what's this referencing? I didn't know, but everybody else in class knew. And I do think it's really interesting how even in public education, which is supposed to be, really secularized, I think that's really pushed, that especially in school we're secularized, but there's really no way to escape it even, like even in school I'm expected to know the basic Christian stories. I'm supposed to know like what, who Adam and Eve are, and just these like, everyone is expected to. So then it's really interesting, if you are a person from a different religion and you just don't have those backgrounds, it's interesting to have that expectation kind of thrown on them, and it's really prevalent in America.
Yeah.
So.
That's interesting to bring up secularization in like schools and stuff, because that just makes me think about the example we used in our article. It's like hijabs in France, and that's really gnarly to me that they can take that away from young women that are just trying to express their religion.
Yeah, I think right now it's happening in America too, because there's this push in a lot of Republican states to have transgender youth genital checks and examinations. In Florida right now, if you're playing a sport and they assume you're transgender, they can do a genital examination. And it's so wrong to me to even think that that's a possibility, but a lot of the legislation is religiously based. And so to really look at that as how are we supposed to separate it in a way where we are protecting youth, we are protecting this, without having to specifically say, well, you can't be Christian, because that's also just as wrong as saying you have to be Christian. And I think it's just a difficult place to be in, but either way you have to be able to separate church and state to a degree where it's not being imposed on other people. I think that we're lacking that in culture a lot, but at the same time, is our goal to force people not to be Christian in our culture? It's just a hard conversation to have.
When comparing it,
Well, like how Andrew was talking yesterday about, there's it's almost impossible to be neutral in some of these issues. Because Christians, not all Christians, but I would say there definitely is a movement to where specifically with transgender, they just don't see that as legitimate. So, and transgender people would maybe argue that Christianity is not legitimate. And so there's not really a way to bridge that perfectly. And so finding that middle ground where you're not harming people is a really difficult spot to be in. But that is supposed to be the ultimate goal, like to protect and to like be like okay with having people. So I don't know.
And I think kind of like off that like note, I think that I largely define like what our religious freedom is the freedom to choose to follow your own religion. And so, you know, I think that, you know, somebody to have the choice to be transgender, to not necessarily follow like scripture or whatever religion, that's like their choice. For me to like not be Christian, it's my choice to not do that or to not follow something that a Christian person might view as moral or something like that. So I think a lot of it just comes down to choice. And like, I think if you're restricting people's choice and like, as long as the law isn't infringing on your right to be Christian and to follow your viewpoints, you know, your viewpoints, then I think that is as close as we can get to like religious freedom.
Yeah, to spiral off that a little bit, like as far as being transgender and like that not being a choice, I think religion.
Yes,
yeah,
no, it's not a choice.
I know what you meant. Yeah, but just as far as that goes, like at what point is a person's personal identity able to be conflicted with? Because if you say, "Oh, I'm Christian," like there is, at least on the surface, the option to say, "I'm no longer Christian." But something like being gay, being transgender, being black, being a different something that you cannot change, it's hard to say that any of those should be able to be controlled by religious people who are using religion to make those choices.
Yes, and I apologize, I was
No.
really incongruent, or like poorly put example. But I was thinking more in like terms of just actual choices that you can make and legally to give those choices to people, to, you know, not try to impose.
Yeah.
Our examples are getting really muddled.
Let me ask this real quick, because it's kind of what you're all tapping into. Like right now, my seniors are reading Kite Runner,
Yeah.
which is written by a guy who grew up in Afghanistan, and so we're talking about that culture. Earlier this semester, my classes we did a unit called Language, Gender, and Culture. We talked about identity, we talked about transgender, we talked about all those things. So those concepts are now making their ways into classrooms, and they're not in a way where it's preachy. Whenever I do it, it's simply, hey, here's an article, let's talk about it, what do you think about this? And really just asking questions because it's the first time some of these kids have had a chance to be privy to this material. So how might that, you know, as we see that that's kind of making its way into the classrooms in some way, kids having a chance to read things they wouldn't have heard otherwise, you know, in their bubbles or in their, you know, cliques or whatever else, how might that have an effect on how we learn things and interpret religion and having that influence culture?
I think it's definitely going to broaden a lot of people's perspectives. I mean, even Gavin was talking about it the other day, just his experience in India and talking to people of different religions and backgrounds and kind of gathering this more understanding perspective on religion and being able to see the similarities and obviously also being able to identify differences. But I think it would just generally cause people to understand more and people to be more accepting of other people's views because you understand where they're coming from. And I think that that lack of understanding is what creates a lot of hostility generally towards other groups. And when creating legislation and when people just, you know, have this very visceral reaction to other people's way of life, I think that's just due to the fact that they don't see where it's coming from.
I agree. It's been like really interesting to see things from the start of freshman year to now, how much more teachers are incorporating different types of writers. I saw it like throughout those 4 years, and that's interesting. And I've really enjoyed learning those things. But I think when it comes to controversial topics, which is kind of I think what you were kind of going at, I think it needs to be careful. But I think I'm glad that like in public school you have the opportunity to talk about those things, as long as the teacher is encouraging you to do your own research and make sure, just because it's very personal for a lot of people, and I think as long as they're not pushing a certain narrative, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know, I think it's definitely very interesting because I think especially in English, because I would say that's like the biggest class where I learn like different cultures because we read literature, and I think that's the only really, I guess because like in history you read like historical background, but this is the only class where we're introduced to like, I guess almost like pop culture in a sense, because this is like what people in a different region are going to read, and this is what, you know, it's really representative of what a culture is, because it's not just the history of it, it's an actual story from that perspective. And I think that just introducing those perspectives, it's going to give us the opportunity to learn more about these different religions, especially as we diversify. where our authors come from and what personal views they might hold. And so I think that's going to encourage that a lot.
I think it's one of the greatest things happening in public education right now is getting those diverse perspectives, because it's now a requirement. It's not just an option for teachers, it's required for them to use these perspectives that are not the typical Christian or Western culture or something like that view. Like, even just translating from another language, you're going to get so much of a difference because so much changes even if you just move one town over. And it's learning to expand your bubble and expand your horizon that is really crucial to society right now. Religion, anything that we're talking about and have been talking about the first few days, or the last few days, that's the only way we're going to progress, is to learn other perspectives.
For more episodes of The Tripod, check out sctripod.com.